I'm Nancy Laffey from Completely Quilted, and I'm so excited to start showing you how to sew our Amish with a Twist block of the month. So this is the first month, and we're going to be starting from the beginning. So if you're a beginning quilter, you're going to be able to start with us step by step on how to make your first quilt. We're going to be sewing from the Amish with a Twist to the classic block of the month booklet. So you'll need to purchase this booklet along with our block of the month kit or follow along using your own fabric. It's essential that you'll need this pattern to be able to determine the sizes for your pieces. In your pattern booklet is a really great key for all the fabrics. So when you purchase our kit, all of our fabrics are labeled so you can make your own fabric key or look at your labels on your fabrics for which colors you're going to cut into what sizes. This is a really great pattern booklet with lots of instructions. So these videos are a companion to teach you step by step some of the instructions that might not be intuitive for you if you're a first-time quilter. So let's start by learning how to cut our fabric. So I'm going to just start by cutting this first piece. This is labeled for us the marsh green, and this is a light for month 1. You're going to have lights and darks and mediums in this quilt, and we've labeled those for you. So one of the common ways to cut fabric is to cut the fabric with it folded. So my cutting mat is a little too small to have my fabric all the way open, and a lot of the time you will fold your fabric to be able to cut strips. So on this particular fabric, I want to make sure when I fold it that my fold is going to be on a horizontal line on my cutting mat. So I'm lining up that horizontal line on my cutting mat. You can notice over here on this side of my fabric piece, it is not even. So a little bit of the fabric is sticking out one way or another. So what I need to do is I need to start by squaring this up and making it totally even. So I'm just going to shift my fabric down so that one of these other lines, I know that I can cut that all even here. So I still have my fold right along a line. Now I have my rotary cutting ruler. This is my long ruler, and I'm using the gypsy gripper, which gives me kind of a handle so that I can hold my fabric and ruler down and have my hand away from my rotary cutter. So you'll need a rotary cutter, you'll need the mat, and you'll need a ruler to be able to cut your pieces for your first quilt. So I'm going to, like I said, I lay the fold along a horizontal line on my cutting mat. And then over here on this side, this little line here, the line number 5, I have all of my edges beyond that line. So I'm going to use that line on my mat, and I'm going to line my ruler up with this line here. So you can see underneath my ruler is a little bit of that fabric all the way along, and that is going to cut and square off that edge. So on my rotary cutter, I want to visually show that my blade, there's lots of rotary cutters out there, this is just my little handy one. So I have my blade exposed, and I'm going to place my blade beyond the fabric, so I'm just on the mat here, right up against my ruler. And I'm just going to follow the edge of that ruler, and I'm putting pressure down on my gypsy gripper and down on my rotary cutter. I'm just cutting with the blade right up against that ruler. So there's my first cut. I'm just going to remove my ruler and just peel away that excess. So it's not even. You can kind of see like really close here. See how that was not even there? Now everything is just perfectly square and even on my mat. And I'm not going to move my fabric here because my fold is still on a line. And now this nice fresh cut edge is just perfect. So now I'm ready to cut whatever width strips my pattern calls me to cut. 2.5 inches is a very common size strip. So I'm going to lay my ruler down now And you can see here on this particular ruler, there is a 2.5 inch line. So that's 1, 2, and then a half away from the 2.5 inch line. I'm going to move my gypsy gripper just to make it easier for you to see those lines all along this strip. So now I'm going to place the 2.5 inch line on the cut edge of my fabric. I still have my fold all along a horizontal line, which is now also on a horizontal line on my ruler. And then that 2.5 inch line, you can see that that perfect, fresh, squared up edge of my strip is on that 2.5 inch line. Now I'm going to use my rotary cutter again along the edge of my ruler. And if you don't have a gypsy gripper, you just want to place pressure down on the ruler. Sometimes I like to put my hand on the far side on the mat as well and make my first cut. Now I have a 2.5 inch strip. And when I open that strip up, there's no little peak or valley. It's a perfectly straight piece. If I lay that down on my mat, that you can see, if this fold was not on a horizontal line, there would be a little mountain in that strip, and you don't want that. So important to note that when you're cutting your fabrics, you should be cutting them from a ironed state. So I won't want to cut this fabric here until I've pressed all of my creases out of it. This is a fat quarter. So a fat quarter is an 18 inch by 22 inch strip. So I want to make sure that when I'm cutting this, if I need a 22 inch or 21 inch strip, I want to cut that from the long direction, not the short dimension. I have my blue fat quarter and it has been pressed, and then I have folded it. So this is the long dimension. So from the selvage edge to this cut edge, it's usually about 22 inches. So I'm going to follow the same rules. I folded that in half, and I've placed that fold along the horizontal line on my cutting mat. Now I'm going to use my long ruler to square up one side to make all of my other cuts. So if I want to cut oops, I shifted it just a little bit, and if that happens, don't worry. You've already cut that edge, and so now what you're going to do is you're just going to line that horizontal line back up with the fold on your mat. And that cut edge is nice and fresh and cut. So if I want to cut a 21 or 22 inch strip by whatever dimension you have, so I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch strip here. When I open this up, now this is 21 or 22 inches. Sometimes I'm going to cut other dimensions, so I might cut some that are 2.5, and then I might cut another size. So I'll need to follow my pattern instructions and cut the next size, just lining up the next size along the edge of your ruler. So whatever that size might be, you'll line up that line along your ruler, measure twice, and then cut only once to make my cut. So opening that up, I have a different dimension now that I've cut from that same piece. I might have another size that'll need to be cut after that. Still, I can leave everything on my cutting mat and just come and refer to my ruler of needing whatever size is next from your pattern instructions. And now I have another size strip. So you always start by cutting your strips and then cutting these strips into squares if that's the dimensions needed from that particular piece of fabric. Cutting fabric, sometimes you may also have fabric that's the width of fabric. So this has 2 selvages here, and it's a much longer piece than the first piece I cut. You're going to follow the same rules and place the horizontal fold on a horizontal line, like we did before. And then you're going to fold up. If you don't have a longer mat, you're going to fold up the bottom fold and place that also on a horizontal line. And if you need to, you can shift it up even higher. So I could choose this horizontal line. And the other rules still apply as well. So you can see on this left-hand side, I'm right-handed, so on this left-hand side, my fabrics are uneven. And so I'm going to place my long ruler down on a line on my mat that will allow me to just cut a little bit off and even up all those edges. So those are just my shreds. And now I can use my ruler and cut whatever sizes my pattern calls for. So if I'm going to cut 2.5-inch strips, I'm going to line that up with my 2.5-inch line on my rotary cutter. Always placing that ruler down on the fresh cut edge and cutting my next piece. And we'll direct you to cut squares. So you will start by cutting a strip. So for example, I'm going to use my 2.5-inch line and cut another 2.5-inch strip. So this is just excess. Now from my strip, I need to cut squares. So I'm going to start by opening up my strip. And I have this edge here. This edge is called your selvage. Okay? And it's not necessary to include it in any of your projects. So I'm going to lay my strip down on my mat with that fresh cut edge along the horizontal line. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut off the selvage. So I'll place the edge of my ruler along a line that allows me to just cut off all of that kind of garbage part of the fabric. I've switched to a square ruler here just because it's smaller and a little bit more manageable to use. But the same rule applies. If I'm going to cut a 2.5-inch square from this strip, I'm going to still use my 2.5-inch marking. So I'm going to place that 2.5-inch line down along the edge of my strip, still placing the horizontal line on my mat along with the horizontal line of the strip. And I'm going to cut my squares. Because I have this folded, I get 2 squares out of each cut. So there's my squares. Now that you have all of your fabric cut and labeled, now you're ready to follow the instructions for sewing. So we're going to start with sewing our strips together. And those strips are going to be sewn into strip sets and then cut apart to create rows of blocks. So when you're deciding what strips to sew together for your strip sets, it's very important that you understand the difference in value between the lights and the mediums. On all of our fabric kits, we have placed labels on all of the colors that you're getting. So for example, in month 1, all of our mediums tell you that they are a medium. And all of our light strips tell you that they are lights. So when you're following the directions, when choosing which fabrics to sew together, make sure that you're using the lights and the mediums in the proper strip sets. But don't agonize too much about which light you're choosing to go with each other. So you can see here I have all of my lights lined up and all of my mediums. So when I'm ready to sew 2 strips together, I'll start with 2 of the light strips. I'm just going to choose 2 that I like. So I'll just start with these 2 here. So I have chosen 2 strips that wasn't hard. You could even throw all the lights in a basket and just pull 2 random ones out, because you're going to be choosing a lot of these to place together. So I have my 2 light strips, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to place these right sides together. So hopefully you can tell from my video that these 2 fabrics here, that's the correct side, or the right side, the pretty side of the fabric. And then there's another side, the wrong side, which doesn't look as pretty. So what you want to do when you're putting your fabric strips together is you're going to place them right sides together. These 2 pieces now placed right sides together, you want to make the edges totally even. So just even up that edge, and then you can place a pin and pin those strips together, right sides together. You may only need a few pins, or you might not be the kind of person that likes to pin strips of fabric together. Now these are going to be stitched all along the long seam with a 1/4 inch seam. It's very important that your seam allowance is an accurate 1/4 inch. Now I'm at my sewing machine ready to sew my strips together. So on my Bernina sewing machine, I'm using the number 37, which is the 1/4 inch patchwork foot. There's another foot that might be of great use for this, and that is also number 57. Number 57 has a guide. It might be easier to see in this particular lesson, so I'll put 57 on so you can see that the edge of the fabric is going to be running up against the edge of that guide, which is a 1/4 inch from the needle in the center position. So I have my first strip set, and I'm going to place that underneath the presser foot with that guide right up against the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to stitch all of the way down. Remember, when you come to a pin, to remove the pin before you continue to sew. Now, when you come to the end of a strip set, this is a really great place to chain piece. Place the next 2 in front of the presser foot, and as you stitch, the machine draws that in underneath, and you can continue sewing your next. As you can see, my workspace is filling up with all kinds of fabrics and labels and stickers, and I'm ready to continue to sew my strip sets. So what I have sewn here is I have my first strip set that I will open up to show you that there is my seam, and the pretty side is facing up because I sewed those right sides together. Here is my second strip set. Also, 2 other lights. I've left some of these labels on, and those have been sewn in a pair as well. So if I want to continue to build this strip set, I can either sew this seam here with these 2 colors together. I could rotate, and so really part of this is just playing around with how you like your fabrics. I kind of like these 2 right next to each other, so now I'm going to place these strip sets together, right sides together. I'm going to move these labels now because I don't want to stitch over them, and I'll just transfer them to the little piles that they belong to. So I'm going to go ahead and place these right sides together. It's the same principle of making sure that your long edges are even, and if you need to, go ahead and place a pin in them so that that long seam won't shift on you, especially since our strip sets are getting a little bit bigger. So now I have 4 strips here that will be sewn along one long side with the same 1/4 inch seam allowance that I sewed before. Now that I've stitched that, you can see that my strips, I have not pressed these yet, but my strip sets now have 4 strips in them. I want to add another one now, just a single, and I'm going to place that here on this top color because I like the way that looks. So I'm going to place that right sides together and make that same step from sewing all the way down. Now don't worry too much if these edges aren't even, or if your selvages are still in your strip, because these are going to be trimmed and cut in the next step. So now that I've pinned along that long edge, I'm ready to stitch this strip onto my strip set. To press my strip set. And I just have my little ironing pad here in my studio today. So I'm just going to show you how I do pressing a little bit by little bit. All of these seams need to be pressed going the same direction, whether you press it to this way or to the light. So it's really best to press from the top side of your fabric. You might be tempted to come to the back side to look at your seams and then to press from this side, because you know that they all need to be going in one direction. For example, this seam kind of seems to want to point upward right now. But we want to always press from the top side of our fabric. So I'm just going to start down here with my bottom seam. I'm kind of feeling that most of the fabric wants to be underneath this cream. So that's the way I'm going to press all of my seams, going down. So I'm going to start by taking my iron and simply just pressing down. I don't do a lot of dragging. I lift up and I press my fabric. So now this section is nicely pressed, and it's pressed going towards that cream. So it's pressed down. Now this next seam needs to be pressed, and so I kind of have to feel it from the back side and kind of move that seam so then it is all facing that same direction, which is down. And now I'm ready to put a little heat and a little press on it. So I'm not ironing, I'm lifting my iron and pressing straight down with pressure. Now you can see on the back side, both of those are now pressed down. Again, with the seam, now this one here, I can feel that I've pushed that seam underneath, so it's facing down, and I'm going to press it simply by lifting up my iron just a little bit and then pressing down. And I don't want to stretch or manipulate the fabric. Same with this top seam, kind of flip it so that that shrimpy kind of pink fabric is on the underneath side, and then I'm going to press that in place. So now these seams are nice and flat and they're all going the same direction. And you can see from the back side that they are as well, and I was working from the top side of the fabric. So I'm going to press this entire strip set. I'm going to continue to sew strip sets, and I'm going to follow my directions, making sure that I'm placing my light strips where they need to be in the set and my mediums where they need to be in the alternate sets. Then we'll be ready for the cross cutting. After you have sewn together your strip sets, now you're ready to cross cut them into your other segments. So cross cutting is kind of like how we cut our strips in the first place. We're always going to line up the edge of our strip set along a horizontal line on our mat. And then I'm going to take my long ruler, and over here I'm going to scoot this down so you can see a little bit more clearly. I'm going to cut off that excess. Remember, sometimes we have some selvage ends that aren't very even. So I'm going to line that edge of my ruler up with the line on my cutting mat. And I'm going to even up that edge. So now I've just trimmed off just the excess, and everything is nice and straight and cut, and also straight along the horizontal line on my mat. Now I'm ready to cut my cross-cut segments. So these are 2.5 inches. So I will place my ruler, again, on that same 2.5 inch line that I used previously to cut my strip sets. And then I will cut my first segment. So that is my cross-cut segment. And so it looks like I cut a bunch of little squares and then sewed all my squares together, when in truth, I cut strips and then saved myself a lot of time. So you'll continue to cut those cross-cut segments. Sometimes you may need to shift your fabric down so that you can continue to cut. It's always important that your seams are on the horizontal, and I'm going to just go ahead and cross-cut these. And it will give you however many cross-cuts you will need to get out of each strip set. You've sewn and cut your strip sets. Now it's time to start sewing some of these back together. So these two units, they each have 3, and I've already pressed these, but now these need to be sewn together. So these are going to be sewn right sides together, and you want those seams to nest. And what that means is the places where I have pressed them, the seams are going in opposite directions. So this seam here was pressed going towards the red, and then the seam here was pressed going towards this goldenrod. And so when I place those fabrics right sides together, that little hump there nests just where it needs to be to create that intersection. So I'm going to place a pin just beyond that segment so that I'm not having to pin right through where that nests. And then you also kind of want to move the fabric here, also with your fingers, to make this seam nest as well. So you can see when I peel that back, that one seam is going one direction and the other is going the other. That's because that was pressed that direction that was indicated in the pattern. And when I place those together, those seams nest. And as you sew, you will be able to kind of feel that and draw that the direction it needs to be. I'm going to place a pin in that as well. So now this seam is going to be sewn with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that seam has been sewn, so hopefully when I open that up, you can see that that seam makes intersections there on those blocks. Now this seam is ready to be pressed. It has been sewn together and pressed. And you can see also on the back side how those seams go in opposite directions. And I don't think it matters how you press that center seam you just sewed. Now I'm ready to sew another set onto this side. And it's important to note where your mediums and lights are in this particular set. So I will also fold this right sides together and make my second portion of this block is that cute little star. So don't get these little pieces, don't let these little pieces get you down or scare you at all, because these blocks are pretty simple to make. So you're going to start with a large square and 2 smaller squares. Remember, the instructions for how big the squares are going to be in your pattern instructions. So you're going to place these squares on top of each other. Remember, right sides together with that corner even. After you have one place, you'll place a second on the opposite corner, the diagonal corner. So now I have these both positioned right sides together. The pattern instructions have you draw a line from corner to corner. But this is where I'm going to use the quick quarter tool. The quick quarter tool is about 1/2 inch wide, and it has these slits in the center. So what you're going to do is you're going to place this down on top of your fabric, and you can see the point of this plastic. So now I'm ready to mark this opposite side. So these are going to be the lines that I stitch on. So I'm going to sew directly on both of these lines, and the area in between is going to be cut apart. Now I'm ready to sew on the marked lines, but it's important to note here that the Bernina foot number 57 guide will get in the way. And so I'm going to be using my quarter of an inch foot number 37 because the lack of the guide will not move the fabric underneath disproportionately. So I'm going to lower my presser foot and I'm going to stitch directly on that marked line. Just gently guiding that underneath the presser foot. Cutting my thread. So that's my first stitch line. Now I'm ready to come underneath and sew on the second line. So now both of my lines have been stitched and I'm ready to cut these apart. Now that I've stitched right on those lines, I can either use my scissor or I can use my rotary cutter to cut in between that area. Now I have two segments that need to be pressed. I'm going to press these seams open. It does not indicate in the pattern to do this step. This is just something that I think reduces the bulk. So you just kind of get in between those seams here, and then you will just press from the back side. I know I've told you not to press from the back, but it's different when you're pressing your seam open. Now I'm ready for my next step, which is placing that same little square on the last corner I have. Same thing, I'm going to place that square along that corner. I'm going to use my quick quarter tool and look at the points of my square in my viewing area, and then I'm going to mark on either side of my quick quarter. Those are going to be my sewing lines. So those are going to be stitched. I've got a cute little chain of these pieces all sewn together. And you can just cut them apart right down the middle. That's the seam allowance. And so now I have my flying geese unit. I'm going to go ahead and trim these apart. And then I will be ready to press these open as well. And I will also trim off some of the dog ears. So if you look over here on this side where we have these kind of little wrong sides poking out from underneath, I'm going to just simply snip these off and make my corners totally even. So this is a great step after you cut your flying geese pieces apart to just go ahead and trim off those little ears because they are not necessary. And this will make it easier to sew your rectangles together in the future. You could also save this step for after you press. So I have these sections ready to press. Remember I said we were going to press those open. So you can see how on the back side here, the first step was already pressed open. Now I'm just going to lay that open as well and press open the opposite side. So now both have been pressed open. I like to view the piece from the right side. Ooh, I got a thread here too. View that from the right side when you're trimming off your little dog ears. And so that is a sweet, cute little flying geese unit that has been pressed open. So continue making these and then we'll be ready to sew our star blocks together. Ready to lay out the elements for my little star blocks. So you'll have your center and you're going to have, and I always like to sew blocks together like this, by laying down my pieces how they'll look when they're stitched. So I've got my star points. Oops, that one didn't get trimmed. There's my star points here. And then you're going to have these corners. And that is what is going to make that star happen. So when you go to stitch this together, you're going to start by sewing these squares onto either side of your triangle. And you'll have one for the top and one for the bottom. And then you will have a center that has the other two sewn. So I'll just place my right sides together, that square, and I'm going to stitch this, and this is a little small to pin. I just kind of pinch that together and go stitch it. On ahead, and I've stitched that for my bottom. So I have that, and then I've also stitched that on the top. And you can wait to press until you have your rows sewn together. My top and bottom row together already, and I've pressed these towards the outside squares. Now I'm ready to sew my inside row together. Same thing, I'm going to place my points right sides together on the center of the block and sew that 1/4 inch seam. Now that seam has been sewn, this will get pressed towards the inside square. Now I'm going to place my last star point right sides together with my center. Now my middle seam has been sewn together, and you can see here on the back side where my seams are pressed towards the inside of the block. Now I'm ready to join these 3 units together by placing my seams right sides together, and these seams here will nest nicely if they've been pressed accordingly. Now I have sewn my bottom to my star point, and now I'm ready to stitch on the top. So I'm placing it right sides together, and I will nest those large seams. Sometimes you will have something like this, where there's a little bit of fullness on one side or another, and you're just going to ease that in. I'm just kind of pulling it a little bit as I sew to flatten that out. So here is my block completed and pressed and ready to go together for my block. So I have my shorter segment, all of my squares together, and that cute little star. So I'm going to start by sewing my star right sides together with my strip set segment. And I'm going to place a couple pins to make sure that I keep my edges even. I'm going to start by sewing this segment together here. Stitch together, and I've pressed towards this segment here. So my seam is facing these blocks. Now I'm ready to place these units here, right sides together. And I also want to make sure my seams are nesting. So I'm going to come back to where I have my intersections of these squares and place a pin just beyond the intersection. I never put my pins right in the intersection. And there I go. I have one completed block. Watching our block of the month 1 video for the Amish with a Twist by Nancy Rink. Remember, you can purchase the pattern on our website, or if you haven't tried yet, get signed up for our block of the month so you can be sewing with us and so that you can use all these great fabrics that we've chosen with all the labels. It makes it a lot easier. And I hope you learned some new techniques and maybe had some fun. This is the block here completed, and we're going to have a lot more different versions of it when we get ready to build the rest of our quilt. So thank you for watching.